Next few minutes, we'll show you why HIV fails as the cause of AIDS and what the real causes could be. We will also explain to you why AIDS is not being caused by conventional sex and why the clean needle and safe sex programs will do little to stop AIDS. You'll have to pay close attention and do some thinking. First, 10 scientific reasons why HIV is not the cause of AIDS. To begin with, let's take a close microscopic look at the virus itself. Number 1. HIV, like all other viruses, is harmless after antibody immunity. HIV is a retrovirus. Retroviruses reproduce themselves through a process called reverse transcription. Its receptacle attaches to the coating of the T cell. It penetrates the cell and encodes its RNA genes into the cell's DNA. And as the cell multiplies, the new viruses break free and go on to reproduce themselves in other cells. Like all viral infections, HIV reproduces rapidly immediately after it infects the body, causing a slight fever and some cold symptoms. But nature has given the human body a built-in defense called antibodies. These tiny protein molecules are generated by the B lymphocyte blood cells to track down and kill invading infections like HIV. Antibodies scour the entire system until all the invading germs are dead or become dormant and inactive. Antibodies are the reason why we get well after a cold and become immune to diseases like chickenpox or the measles. Ironically, when a person is tested for HIV with the blood test, they are not testing for the virus, but the antibody that has been generated to stop it. When a person tests positive to HIV, they have produced their own antibody vaccine, which means they are now immune to the virus. All infectious diseases must win the race against the immune system's antibodies to kill the host. There are no known diseases that ever reemerge to cause the illness after the antibodies have done their job.
No, there's no such disease, no precedent for it. All other microbes cause diseases primarily before immunity, before antibodies are around. And that's the only reason why you and I are talking now, because antibodies protect us against microbes. Once you have antibodies, you're safe against these microbes. The whole basis for vaccination, 200 years old. Edward Jenner came up with that, or others too, but he did. He's the name in it. There's not one precedent where a microbe only causes disease after immunity. Some come back. There are always some marginal exceptions to this generalization. It's not a real exception, but partial. But none ever had caused the disease only after antibodies appeared, which is how AIDS is defined. None.
Every 8th grade biology student should question why this basic fact of science has been turned upside down with HIV. The taxpayer should ask why we've spent 12 years and billions of dollars developing a vaccine against HIV when the best vaccine possible already exists when an individual tests positive. Reason number 2. HIV does not kill the T cells it infects. AIDS patients are losing T cells, and because these are the cells HIV infects, it was assumed that HIV was killing them. But only under rare laboratory conditions do retroviruses kill their host cells. In fact, Robert Gallo and other AIDS researchers use T cells to grow the virus because T cells live quite compatibly with HIV. This claim that a retrovirus was killing T cells was what sparked Peter Duesberg's suspicions based on his experience with retroviruses in cancer research.
And here Gallo comes along and says, well, HIV is causing AIDS by killing T cells. When the T cells are killed, the immune deficient, and immune deficiency produces AIDS. That didn't seem to fit with everything we ever learned about retroviruses and knew about retroviruses, namely that retroviruses do not kill cells. Retroviruses are set apart from virtually all other animal viruses we know, human and animal viruses, in that they do not kill the cell they infect, ever. They are not killer viruses. That's why they are at least plausible cancer viruses causing a disease. A virus that could cause a cancer, a disease, would be one that couldn't kill a cell. If it killed the cell, there wouldn't be a cancer.
Reason number 3. HIV does not infect enough T cells to cause AIDS. Even if HIV killed the T cells it infects, it does not infect enough cells to cause AIDS. Shortly after HIV is brought under control by the antibody defense, the billions of virus particles become dormant and begin to disappear.
Before long, the virus can hardly be found in T cells at all, infecting only one cell out of every 1,000, and sometimes as few as one cell out of every 100,000.
On the other hand, T cells can reproduce at the rate of 5% a day. Simple math proves that HIV cannot infect enough T cells to cause them to die off and bring down the entire immune system. Even supporters of HIV admit that this low amount of T cell infection is a challenge to explain.
AIDS patients are characterized by the deficiency or depletion of T cells. They lack T cells, that's why they are AIDS patients. But when the first data appeared, in fact, many from Gallo's, the first real good data on that came from Gallo's lab. The surprising news was there was no virus found in T cells. Practically none. In fact, the notorious difficulties of our nation's leading, at that time, leading AIDS researcher, Robert Gallo, in finding the virus led him to his now well-known problems with essentially appropriating or misappropriating, stealing the virus from Montagnier. He couldn't isolate the virus because there was no virus there, not because he's incompetent, simply he confirmed what we are just talking about, there is no virus in AIDS patients, only antibodies against it. So if 1 in 1,000 cells or even 1 in 100 cells is infected by a virus, you won't get a disease from it, you won't die from it. In order to die from a depletion of T cells, you would need to have a virus that kills more than half of them. It's like saying you're dying, you're a 25-year-old man suffering a fatal disease or dying from a fatal disease because you stuck yourself with a needle or cut yourself while shaving. You're losing about 100s or thousands of your blood with a bad cut and shaving. You're not going to die from that. But that's what Gallo's hypothesis actually said.
Reason number 4. HIV has no AIDS-causing gene. HIV has no specific gene or unique genetic reason to cause AIDS. All retroviruses have only 3 major genes, GAG, INF, and POL, and only 6 minor genes. Because the genes and genetic sequences are so limited in these very simple little viruses, they need all the genes to replicate. HIV is almost identical to all other retroviruses genetically. What most people do not know is that there are as many as 50 to 100 of these retroviruses that can be found in every healthy human body. All have the same 3 genes, and all are kept under control by antibodies after infection. HIV behaves no differently than the others in the way that it mutates, becomes dormant, and reactivates. So the question is, if none of these other retroviruses cause diseases, why should HIV? Or vice versa, if HIV causes AIDS, why don't all the rest? So there's no genetic reason to explain why HIV would cause AIDS. Number 5. There is no such thing as a slow virus. HIV is said to be a slow virus that takes 10 to 12 years after infection to cause AIDS. The only way to explain this is to give HIV magical abilities to reactivate, mutate, migrate, and hibernate. These slow virus hypotheses were devised by scientists like Gajdusek and Gallo, who used them to buy time when their disease-causing agent failed to perform. They based their slow virus hypotheses on studies of Epstein-Barr, which was supposed to cause a cancer 10 years after infection, and herpes viruses that hide and reemerge in persons who have suppressed immunity and can't generate a sufficient defense. But these differ greatly from HIV, because in both cases large amounts of active virus can be found, causing specific symptoms.
In total contrast, HIV is inactive, then is said to cause 30 different diseases 10 years later, none of which are specific to HIV itself.
Peter Duesberg says, there's no such thing as a slow virus, only slow virologists.
A virus, including a retrovirus, causes a disease within days, weeks, or at the very most, a month after infection. And that is not a mysterious number. That number is a direct function of the generation time of the virus, the time a virus needs to infect a cell and generate new virus particles. And that takes, with all viruses we know of in humans, all of them, including HIV and including all retroviruses, at the very most 1 or 2 or 3 weeks. So whatever a virus could possibly do has to happen in that time period, or else it's not caused by that virus. And with AIDS, Everybody, even from the very beginning, talked about a so-called minimal latent period of, or average latent period of 1 year, and now they have raised that to 10 years. In other words, we are buying lots and lots of time for something else to cause the disease that is in fact blamed on that virus. There is not, in 10 or 12 years of research, 35 billion by the American taxpayer alone, not to mention private organizations and companies in other countries. There is not even a shred of light on this question, why it would take 10 years from the infection to a disease. In fact, it's impossible.
Reason number 6. HIV is not a new virus, so HIV would not suddenly cause a new epidemic. AIDS cases have increased dramatically from 0 in 1980 to 500,000 by 1996, so researchers assumed that it could only be caused by a new virus spreading quickly into the population. An old virus would have caused an AIDS epidemic years ago, possibly even centuries ago, so HIV must be a new infection to cause the recent AIDS epidemic. But here again, the HIV/AIDS proponents bypassed yet another essential question of logic. How old is HIV and where did it come from? Theories about green monkey bites and traveling gay flight attendants run in the headlines, but no one in the entire government-funded research program has bothered to verify the age of HIV. Peter Duesberg says HIV is very old, using the fundamental means of dating viruses found in Farr's law.
Farr was a British epidemiologist, William Farr, in the first part of the 19th century, who noted when a new epidemic comes into a population, like AIDS is said to be new, or the virus causing it is said to be new as well, and then it spreads exponentially in that population. Translated into current tabloid newspaper reporting, it explodes into that population, like a seasonal flu epidemic. That's what Farr's law says. But if a microbe and a disease is long established, then it's old. So when you look at HIV in America, you'll find ever since it can be detected, 1 million Americans are positive. That was first reported by the Centers for Disease Control in 1985 and has since been repeated over and over and over every year for 10 years or 11 years now, almost 12 years now. So if it's in 1 million Americans for 10 years every single year, that can't be new. And those statistics are harder than anything we ever had in microbiology. 25 million Americans are tested once a year. It's 10%. A Gallup poll is usually within a percentile when you test 10,000 Americans, or 5,000 they call them by phone, and they get it within a percentage accuracy. This is done on 25 million people for 10 years. Nothing has ever been checked so carefully. That's an extremely hard number. This thing is, age is old. This virus is in America is older than America. It came in with the immigrants. That's older than the Constitution.
So, HIV is not a new virus, and many of the people who have antibodies to it got it perinatally or from their mothers, not from dirty needles or unsafe sex, and have lived full healthy lives for centuries without AIDS. Number 7. HIV fails Koch's postulates. The universal test used by scientists to determine if a disease is truly being caused by an infection was designed over 100 years ago by Robert Koch, who discovered the bacteria that causes TB. HIV fails this test. Koch's postulates state, first, the virus or bacteria must be found in all cases of the disease. Second, this germ must be isolated from the infected host and grown in a pure culture. Third, the germ must cause the same disease when injected into a new healthy host. And finally, the germ must be found growing again in the newly diseased host. HIV fails postulate number 1 because 10 to 20% of all AIDS patients have no HIV at all. When HIV can be found, it is only in very small amounts and usually dormant. HIV passes postulate number 2 only on a technicality. It can be isolated, but it takes huge amounts of cell tissue to find it. Then a difficult chemically induced process is needed to reactivate the virus. By contrast, large amounts of active virus can easily be found with other diseases. HIV fails postulate 3 hands down. HIV does not cause AIDS when injected into test animals like chimpanzees. And more importantly, human healthcare workers accidentally infected with HIV rarely get AIDS unless they use drugs and AZT. Robert Gallo and the HIV orthodoxy have dismissed Koch's postulates as old and out of date with modern medicine. But the postulates have stood the test of time, and scientists who have ignored and bypassed them have done so at their own peril.
Time after time, with diseases like scurvy, beriberi, pellagra, SMAN, and even the failed virus cancer program, all ignored Koch's postulates and all proved to be non-infectious. All efforts to find infectious causes ended in a dismal failure. And now, HIV and AIDS?
It's obvious that HIV fails to cause AIDS beneath the microscopic lens and on the drawing board. But it doesn't fly in the population studies either. When we use the telescopic lens to observe the population at large, HIV's failure becomes linked to real names and faces. The population studies prove beyond a doubt that HIV does not cause AIDS. Number 8. AIDS has remained in its original risk groups for over 12 years.
When an infectious epidemic strikes, it begins in small clusters, then quickly spreads throughout the entire population. If a disease does not spread, it is not contagious and must be caused by something non-infectious. Figures compiled by the Centers for Disease Control confirm that AIDS is not spreading into the population at large and is locked in its original risk groups. Homosexual males, IV drug users, hemophiliacs, and blood transfusion patients make up 97% of all AIDS patients and have continued at that rate for over 10 years. The remaining 3% of AIDS patients outside these risk groups are made up of persons who suffer from immunodeficiency at random and just happen to be infected with HIV. If AIDS is truly being caused by a virus, the patients who do not fit into these risk groups would be growing above the 3% as the disease spread. But AIDS has failed to spread into the female population also. When the U.S. Army began testing new recruits for HIV in 1984, they discovered an amazing fact. HIV infection was evenly spread between males and females 50-50, and it's remained that way since then. It should follow that AIDS would be 50% male and 50% female. Yet 9 out of every 10 people who develop AIDS continue to be male. A germ-related disease should be spread evenly between the sexes, and though HIV is evenly spread, 90% of all U.S. AIDS cases develop only in males.
This could explain why drug use is more related to AIDS than HIV infection. In the U.S., males use over 80% of all hard psychoactive drugs. And among the women with AIDS, over half use IV drugs also.
In times past, every infectious disease has taken its toll on doctors, nurses, and healthcare workers who work with the infected. Yet AIDS has failed to spread here as well. With over 500,000 cases of AIDS, hardly one physician has developed AIDS as a result of an occupational HIV infection. In healthcare workers and laboratory technicians who cultivate high amounts of active HIV, there have been hundreds of confirmed accidental exposures and infections. Yet within the field of 5 million healthcare workers, only a handful of cases of AIDS have been reported, and even these are highly disputed. From the statistics generated by this vast population study, it becomes evident AIDS is more related to behavior and specific medical risks than it is to HIV infection. Even supporters of HIV concede AIDS is not becoming the world pandemic that was predicted. Reason number 9. International comparison of AIDS differ greatly. A germ-related disease would affect a population in the same way around the world.
For example, an outbreak of cholera in India would be similar to an outbreak in Honduras. But AIDS statistics are totally different in the U.S. and Western industrialized nations compared to Africa.
In the U.S., AIDS patients are 90% male, but in Africa, AIDS is evenly spread between the sexes.
In the U.S., AIDS resides among risk groups at the rate of 97%. Yet in Africa, AIDS has no risk groups and is found at random in the general population. Only 62% of the AIDS diseases in the U.S. are microbial, but in Africa that number is approximately 90%. Likewise, the AIDS diseases in the U.S. that are not germ-related make up 38% of the total, a number that does not correlate with Africa at only 10%. HIV is believed to have originated in Africa, where an estimated 14 million have the virus. Because of malnutrition and other health conditions conducive to AIDS, statistics from Africa should be at least 14 times higher than in the U.S. Yet surprisingly, it's quite the opposite. People infected with HIV in the U.S. develop AIDS at a rate 10 to 20 times faster than Africans. Figures from the CDC and the World Health Organization have confirmed this since 1987 through 1995.
So the question is, why would the AIDS epidemic behave so differently in the industrialized world?
One good explanation is that HIV does not cause AIDS, and the real causes are hard psychoactive drugs used primarily in the U.S. and Europe. Duesberg questions if what is being called AIDS in Africa is really the same epidemic.
But the African epidemic, I think, is a completely different epidemic. It affects men and women alike. In America, AIDS is 90% men, and in Europe, 90% men. That's epidemiologically as different as day and night. 50% compared to 90% is completely different. That's a totally different epidemic, the African one. And the diseases, likewise, are very different in the two continents. So clinically and epidemiologically, the two epidemics are very different. And in Africa, it's possibly malnutrition, parasitic infection, and poor sanitation. It affects, there are no risk groups. There's not homosexuals or intravenous drug users. It's just poor people without running water, without supermarkets, without doctors.
The London Sunday Times questions whether AIDS in Africa is a myth. Quoting Dr. Kohutni Ohulu, if tens of thousands are dying of AIDS in Africa, where are their graves?
Well, one of the members of our group is a fellow called Philippe Kreinen, who is up there in Tanzania, which is thought to be the epicenter of the AIDS outbreak. And there he and his wife, Evelyn, went to deal with orphans with AIDS. They're kind of well-to-do French do-gooders who, by the way, got quite a lot of money from France, I'm told, and who popularized the idea of AIDS in Africa. Well, after being on the ground there in Tanzania for a couple of years, he reported that after all this time we have to conclude that there is no AIDS and there are no orphans. The people that were thought to be orphans were actually being taken care of by their grandparents, while their own parents were off in Dar es Salaam making money. They came back at the end of the dry season or something like that. It's an amazing story. The AIDS diseases that these people were suffering from were just the same old diseases that everybody was suffering from in Africa from time immemorial. The only difference now is that if it was called an AIDS disease, then WHO and the United Nations send money. If it's called a diarrhea, what's new about a diarrhea in Africa? But if it's an AIDS diarrhea, well, then the United States sends money.
Finally, reason number 10. AIDS occurs without HIV infection, and most people with HIV never develop AIDS.
The evidence in support of the HIV hypothesis is based solely on correlation. Because the virus is often found in most AIDS patients, we have assumed HIV is causing AIDS. But the logic of that assumption is flawed because correlation does not prove causation. For example, the presence of HIV in AIDS patients is no more proof of the cause than the presence of birds on power lines prove that the birds cause power failures. They only correlate. So if HIV is a harmless passenger virus that only correlates with other real causes of AIDS, we should expect to see two things: people with AIDS who are not infected with HIV, and HIV-infected people who are healthy and do not get AIDS. And that is exactly what is happening. What's also important is that different risk groups develop different diseases. Why would HIV supposedly cause one set of diseases in IV drug users and another set in homosexual males? Unless HIV is not the cause and other causes are at work. Do we find these specific AIDS diseases in the risk groups among persons who do not have the virus? The answer is definitely yes. Diseases like Kaposi sarcoma and advanced cytomegalovirus, which strike primarily gay males, have been found in numerous homosexual men who do not have HIV. But these men have one common denominator: the use of nitrite inhalants as aphrodisiacs that are known to be immunosuppressive. Thousands of American drug addicts who are not infected with HIV get the same tuberculosis, wasting syndrome, and pneumonias, and even lose the same CD4 T cells as those who are HIV positive. The slow death that resembles AIDS in heroin addicts has been observed and documented in the medical literature since 1898. So in these two risk groups that comprise over 90% of U.S. AIDS cases, there are other factors at work that could cause AIDS and have for years. Peter Duesberg says there are 4,621 documented AIDS cases without HIV, and this number is much lower than it may actually be.
4,621. So that was in '93. In the meantime, I could probably easily get this number over 5,000. But the number isn't growing as fast as it could or should, because if a person is reported with a clinical AIDS diagnosis and is HIV negative, he or she will not appear in national AIDS statistics. They will say, well, it's Kaposi, that's not AIDS. It's pneumonia or pneumocystis pneumonia. It's not AIDS because it's not HIV positive. And people are, I mean, I know in fact people are examples of people who told me under condition of anonymity, they had observed this in Stanford and in San Francisco, the public health, and were pressured not to publish this, simply not to mention it. Or if they published it, not in an AIDS journal and under an AIDS listing. The same thing is happening in England and everywhere else. So these cases mostly date from the early days on HIV and AIDS in the 80s and early 90s, when people were still genuinely asking, is HIV actually found in all AIDS cases? And they reported actually 4,621 cases that I could easily find of AIDS diagnosis in the absence of HIV. And more have accumulated since, but not as many, because people know now what to say and what not to say in order to survive in this competitive world.
The official definition of AIDS is designed to eliminate every case of AIDS that presents an embarrassing non-correlation against HIV.
The official definition of AIDS is 30 previously known old diseases in the presence of antibody against HIV. So if you have Kaposi sarcoma and HIV antibodies, you're an AIDS patient. Without it, you're a Kaposi patient. Pneumonia with HIV antibodies is AIDS. In the absence is pneumonia. Dementia in the absence of HIV antibodies is dementia, and with it, it's AIDS. That's the AIDS definition. There is no HIV-specific disease anywhere. Unlike any other microbe that causes a specific disease, just like an instrument makes a specific sound, HIV doesn't make a specific sound. It causes, is said to cause 30 previously known diseases when it's there, and when it's not there, the original causes of these diseases are responsible for them. That is the official definition of AIDS, not my joke.
Using this official definition, HIV proponents arrive at a near 100% correlation between the virus and AIDS. And remember, the HIV hypothesis is based solely on correlational evidence.
And you can find a correlation, there's no question about it. If you ignore all the cases where there isn't a correlation, you have a correlation. But that's very bad science, and it's very bad epidemiology as well.
Critics say this correlation is not objective or scientific, and deceptively self-fulfilling.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, yes. And science is designed to get around self-fulfilling prophecies, but in this case it's proceeding on the basis of one.
Finally, the most convincing argument against HIV: the millions of people worldwide who have the virus and are not becoming sick. This is very apparent in Africa, where 97% of those with HIV are healthy and do not have AIDS. Documented AIDS cases amount to only 3%. Also in the U.S., where only 500,000 infected have progressed to full-blown AIDS over a 15-year latency period. And this figure does not account for the 19 new diseases defined by the CDC as AIDS and 62,000 AIDS patients who were never tested for the virus. It is evident HIV does not cause AIDS in most people, and this evidence becomes stronger every year. Robert Gallo, Anthony Fauci, and the entire scientific and political campaign based on HIV are in serious, serious trouble. And as the foundation of the scientific support for this multi-billion-dollar hypothesis crumbles, the real causes of AIDS will continue to take hundreds of thousands of lives. Yet the hollow campaign goes on like a broken record.
We have a long way to go in the fight against HIV. The virus that causes AIDS. 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 The virus that causes AIDS.